The First World War is widely regarded as a pointless, horrific, murderous, uniquely hideous conflict. It's almost become a symbol of tragedy, of futility, of disaster. Now, don't get me wrong, the First World War was hell on earth, but so is the trench warfare in eastern Ukraine today, the street fighting in Bakhmut. And so was Napoleon's Russian campaign of 1812, when the vast majority of his troops starved. World War I was not uniquely awful, but we've come to believe in several powerful myths about that war. We shouldn't fall for them. If we do, we risk minimizing the experience of soldiers and civilians caught up in countless other appalling conflicts throughout history and the present day. So I'm going to take a look at the myths and explain the reality. Let's go. It was history's bloodiest war. Nope, the Second World War was far more costly. World War I wasn't even the bloodiest at that point in history. A half a century before the First World War, China was torn apart by an even bloodier conflict. Estimates of the dead in the 14-year Taiping Rebellion go as high as 30 million. Around 10 million soldiers were killed during the First World War, with perhaps the same number of civilians, so not as many as the Taiping Rebellion. Although around 900,000 Brits died in the First World War, more than any other conflict for which we have reliable data, we think the bloodiest war in British history relative to population size are the civil wars of the mid-17th century. Less than 2% of the British population died in World War I. By contrast, we think 4% of the population of England and Wales, and considerably more than that in Scotland and Ireland, are thought to have died during the civil wars. During the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 48, millions died in Europe, perhaps 20% of the entire population. The French lost an appalling 1.4 million men in the war, 20% of those who served. But this figure of 1.5 million is what some historians believe the French also lost in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of 1792 to 1815. The American losses for World War I are around 110,000, less than 20% of Americans killed during the Civil War. Most of the troops who fought were killed. No, they weren't. The vast majority of those who fought came home. And I'm not belittling the fact that, of course, huge numbers of survivors had lifelong mental and physical injuries. But there are many examples in the history of campaigns in which most soldiers did not survive. That's traditionally because armies had lost many more men to disease and hunger than they had to enemy action. This was still true in the First World War for the Americans, but not for other nations. In World War I, troops were now screened for tuberculosis. Efforts were made to ensure they had clean drinking water and careful management of human waste. Troops were better supplied with food and clothing which could be carried on railways from industrial economies back home. Very different to previous centuries. Doctors in World War I had antiseptic, access to blood transfusion, and effective tetanus treatments. This meant that while a shocking number of men were killed in battle, the majority of men were able to survive through their years of service and even survive terrible wounds which would have killed them a few generations before. In the UK, around 6 million men were mobilised, of which around 11.5% were killed. In fact, as a British soldier, you were more likely to die during the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 than in the First World War. In the Crimea, the British lacked winter clothes to survive the cold Russian winter, and some starved due to lack of supplies. There were 2 million American troops in Europe. Of these, just 50,000 were killed in battle, and around 60,000 died of other causes, mostly the Great Influenza. So 95% of American servicemen went home. The rich commanded, the poor died. This is way too simplistic. The great majority of casualties in the First World War were from working classes who made up the vast majority of the population. It's also true that most of the generals were from affluent backgrounds, but there were exceptions. Britain's most senior soldier, Sir William Robertson, had been born into a working family. He worked as a footman, a servant in a big house before joining the army as a private, the lowest possible rank, in 1877. The US commander in Europe, John Pershing, was the son of a farmer and store owner. The children of the social and political elite did their fair share of dying and fighting too. In fact, they were hit disproportionately hard by World War I. These young, highly educated, motivated, indoctrinated young men provided the junior officers whose job it was to lead the way over the top and expose themselves to the greatest danger as an example to their men. Just over 11% of the British Army's ordinary soldiers were killed during the war, compared with 20% of its officers. The elite private school Eton, which produced an array of British Prime Ministers, alone lost more than 1,000 former pupils, 1 in 5 of those who served. One French general, Castelnau, lost 3 sons. A British general, Edmund Allenby, lost his only child in the trenches. UK wartime Prime Minister Herbert Asquith lost a son, while future Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law lost 2 sons. The future Prime Minister Winston Churchill led his men out on nighttime raids into no man's land and famously never ducked when a bullet passed with a crack. A later Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, lost 2 brothers. Another one was terribly wounded and an uncle was captured. Nor did being a general mean you were out of the action either. During the war, more than 200 British generals were killed, wounded or captured. In percentage terms, 18% of British generals that served in World War I would lose their lives during the conflict. In just 9 days, in late September and early October 1914, 8 British generals were killed, wounded or captured. Senior commanders were expected to visit the front lines nearly every day. In battle, they were considerably closer to the action than generals are today. In October 1915, 3 senior generals were killed in the space of a week, prompting Britain's most senior soldier to order generals not to expose themselves to danger. The loss of leadership was disastrous for the formations they commanded. It was all fought in France and Belgium. The fighting on the Western Front in France and Belgium ran from the summer of 1914 till the late autumn, the fall of 1918. There wasn't much movement, and it was the main focus of the British Army's effort. It was close to home, you could even hear the bombardments in southeast England, so not surprisingly it looms very large in the British telling of the war. But the war was fought all over the world. The first shots were fired by Royal Navy ships in the Bahamas. The first shot a British soldier fired was Al-Haji Grunshi in West Africa. He was in the Gold Coast Regiment and he fired at German forces while invading Togoland. The British attacked the Ottoman Empire in the Levant, eventually capturing what's now Israel, Jordan and a bit of Syria. The Allies attacked Turkey in the Balkans and eventually reached Istanbul. They also attacked Austria in northern Italy in the Balkans, and they fought an endless campaign against the Germans in East Africa. The Allies also received Japanese support to occupy German ports in China. And there was massive fighting on the Eastern Front between Austria and Germany and the Russian Empire. Nearly 2 million Russians and 1 million Austro-Hungarians would die on this front, more dead than France and Britain respectively. This was a much bloodier theatre with more movement than the Western Front. Churchill and others hoped that eventually pressure on these other fronts might weaken Germany and avoid the necessity of defeating her main field army on the Western Front. Lots of senior military commanders disagreed. They argued that Germany had to be defeated where it was strongest. In the end, they were both right. The German army was forced to retreat through Belgium, and at the same time, Austria, Turkey, Bulgaria collapsed in the autumn of 1918 and had a major impact on the determination of the Germans to go on fighting. They were lions, led by donkeys. This is one of the most famous sayings about the First World War. The idea is that these heroic, brave young men were slaughtered on the orders of incompetent old men. First of all, this quote was alleged to be a German general talking about the British, but in fact it was made up by a historian. The men were certainly lions, no question about that. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, men of the Sherwood Foresters overcame the odds to get into the German trenches. They were cut off, they were battered by counterattacks, they ran out of ammunition, they fought with shovels, knives and fists before being wiped out. A few survivors crawled back after nightfall. 80% of the unit was killed, wounded or captured. These men were definitely lions. And some of the leaders were donkeys. As in any organisation, there are going to be a few useless people around. But there were lots of clever, talented men in senior positions in the various militaries wrestling with how to win this war. Naturally, some generals were not up to the job. The Italian Luigi Cardona sent his men time and again into battle with the same plan and the same bloody outcome. Russian Tsar Nicholas was pretty useless when he decided stupidly to take direct control of Russia's military effort. But in that, trust me, the First World War was no different to any war that has gone on before or has come after. There were brilliant generals such as Arthur Currie, a middle-class Canadian, failed insurance broker and property developer. His slogan was, "Pay the price of victory in shells, not lives." He saw the war would be won by the overwhelming application of firepower, behind which the well-trained and prepared troops could advance. He took advice from his excellent staff. He was never too grand to change his mind. Men like him and the Australian Sir John Monash pioneered a new way of war in which tanks and artillery, vehicles, planes and men moved forward as one, helping each other, coordinating, overcoming challenges together. Rarely in history have commanders had to adapt to a more radically different technological environment. British commanders had been trained to fight small colonial wars. The American commander Pershing had fought as a young man against the Apache on the Great Plains. Now, they were thrust into a massive industrial struggle unlike anything they'd ever experienced. There was no more galloping across wide open space, searching for small groups of lightly armed but skilled warriors. War was now fought in massive defences, deep concrete bunkers, amid shattered muddy landscapes. Millions of men were now under their command. Thousands of planes and guns. Tanks and poison gas had appeared on the battlefield. Despite this, within 3 years, the British and the Americans had learned from their experience, and they learned from their allies and enemies alike, to effectively invent a new way of making war. By the summer of 1918, the British Army was probably at its best ever, and it inflicted a series of crushing defeats upon the Germans. Men were stuck in their trenches for years on end. The image we have of the First World War is that the soldiers lived for month after month in miserable trenches, partially flooded, awful smelling, under constant threat from the enemy in their trench, just a few hundred yards away across no man's land. The frontline trenches could be a terribly hostile place to live. Units, often wet, cold and exposed to the enemy, would lose their morale and suffer high casualties if they spent too much time in frontline trenches. As a result, the British Army rotated men in and out continuously. In normal times, between big battles, a unit spent perhaps 4 days a month in the front line trench, perhaps 8 days a month in the second and third line. The rest of the month, you might be training or labouring on new fortifications behind the lines. It was not unusual to be out of the line for a month. During moments of crisis, such as big offensives, the British occasionally could spend up to 7 days on the front line, but were far more often rotated out after just a day or two. When the men were behind the lines, they visited bars and brothels, they played sports, they even got to take leave in Britain. Nothing changed. Generals just tried the same old tactics again and again. It's true that some generals kept using the same old tactics, and their men paid for their commanders' lack of imagination in their blood. But the bigger story of the First World War is the extraordinary innovation. Never have tactics and technology changed so radically in 4 years of fighting. In 1914, generals on horseback galloped across battlefields. The French wore red trousers. Soldiers on all sides wore cloth or leather hats rather than helmets. Soldiers advanced in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder. Cavalry charged knee to knee with sabres raised, as they'd done on battlefields 100 years earlier. There were a few very primitive aircraft, mainly in reconnaissance roles, and no tanks. Both sides were overwhelmingly armed with rifles. 4 years later, the battlefield had been transformed. Steel-helmeted combat teams rushed forward, protected by a curtain of artillery shells. They were now armed with flamethrowers, portable machine guns, and grenades fired from underneath rifles. Above them, planes, which were unimaginably more sophisticated than those of 1914, jeweled in the skies. Some carried experimental wireless radio sets, reporting real-time reconnaissance and even targeting the artillery. Those huge guns fired with pinpoint accuracy. Using only aerial photos and maths, they could score a hit with the first shot. The troops might be supported by armoured fighting vehicles. Tanks had armour plating which allowed them to withstand small arms fire, while tracks meant they could traverse the smashed landscape and crush barbed wire. The pace of change is reflected by the fact that the tank went from the drawing board to the battlefield in just 2 years. First heading across no man's land at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. Everyone who fought in it hated it. This one is hard to talk about, but the truth is that some people enjoy war. Like all conflicts, it comes down to luck. You may witness unimaginable horrors that leave you mentally and physically incapacitated for the rest of your life. Or you might get away without a scratch. It could be the best of times, it could be the worst of times. Bit of both, or neither. Some soldiers enjoyed the First World War. If they were lucky, they would avoid a big offensive. They might get posted somewhere quiet where conditions would actually be better than they might have experienced at home. For the British, there was meat every day, a rare luxury back home. There were cigarettes, tea and rum, part of a daily diet of more than 4,000 calories. Remarkably, absentee rates due to sickness, which is an important barometer of a unit's morale, were hardly above those of peacetime. Many young men enjoyed the guaranteed pay, the intense camaraderie, the responsibility, greater sexual freedom that they'd had in peacetime Britain. Pay for a British infantryman was about £1 a day, perhaps around a half as much as an agricultural labour might get, but food and accommodation was free and there was guaranteed work year-round. There was intense comradeship. Men and women felt like they were engaged in a mighty joint effort. A war poet wrote, "I adore war. It's like a big picnic, but without the objectivelessness of a picnic. I have never been more well or more happy." An Italian writer, Emilio Lusu, watched a film which was based on his autobiographical novel about the war. He objected that it was too grim. "That's not all there is to war," he said. "Sometimes we even sang, joked, and dreamed our dreams." A Canadian veteran wrote that war was the greatest adventure of my life, the memories of which will remain with me for the remainder of my days, and I would not have missed it for anything. No one won. Swathes of Europe lay wasted, millions were dead or wounded, survivors lived on with severe mental trauma. Even some of the victorious powers were pretty much bankrupt. The fighting was rumbling on across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Like most wars, it did not lead to a lasting and satisfactory peace. So it's a bit odd to talk about winning. But in a narrow military sense, the French, the Brits, the Americans and their allies had convincingly won. Germany's battleships had been bottled up by the Royal Navy until their crews mutinied. Germany's army collapsed under a series of mighty Allied blows, which smashed through supposedly impregnable defences. By late September 1918, the German Emperor and his military mastermind Erich Ludendorff admitted that there was no hope for Germany and they must beg for peace. The 11th of November armistice was essentially a German surrender. The Austro-Hungarian armies collapsed on the Italian front and in the Balkans. The empire was torn apart by revolution. Allied forces marched on Constantinople and Turkey surrendered. The Central Powers lost the First World War. the Allies achieved their political ends through violence, which is what war is all about. The British had fought to defend Belgian sovereignty, and in 1918, Belgium was once again an unoccupied free country. Britain also wanted to neutralise the German naval threat. By Christmas 1918, the German battle fleet was a prisoner in a British naval base. The French had wanted the Germans out of France. They achieved this. They even immediately got back 2 provinces which the Germans had taken off them in the mid-19th century. And the Germans agreed to station no troops at all in the Rhineland, the German borderland with France. The Americans were happy to see every single German submarine surrendered to the Allies. And don't forget Serbia. The war had begun when Austria-Hungary had invaded Serbia way back in 1914. Well, now Serbia was once again independent. Ultimately, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires no longer existed by Christmas 1918. The Turkish Empire was occupied, partitioned, and would also be gone within a couple of years. That's losing. The Treaty of Versailles was so harsh. The myth goes that the Treaty of Versailles was so harsh that it left Germany humiliated, angry, hobbled, motivating the Germans to rearm and throw off this unjust yoke. But it just doesn't stand up. The Allies confiscated 10% of Germany's territory, but left it the largest, richest nation in Central Europe. The country was largely unoccupied, and financial reparations were linked to its ability to pay, which mostly went unenforced anyway. The treaty was notably less harsh than the 2 treaties that ended the wars either side of the First World War, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and World War II. The German victors in the Franco-Prussian War had annexed 2 large chunks of 2 rich French provinces, part of France between 200 and 300 years, and home to most of French iron ore production. They'd also presented France with a massive bill for immediate payment. After World War II, Germany was occupied. It was split into different countries. Its factories, its machinery smashed, stolen. Millions of prisoners forced to stay with their captors and work as slave labourers. After World War II, Germany lost all the territory it lost after World War I and another giant slice on top of that. Yet we don't talk about the post-World War II treaty being overly harsh. Also, the treaty with the Turks was much harsher. The majority of Turkish territory, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Arabia, all taken over by the British and French or made into independent countries. The Turkish Empire had been over 600,000 square miles in size in 1914, and it was reduced by half. And like Germany, Turkey was also not allowed a big army, powerful battleships, or an air force. The treaty was also nowhere near as harsh as the treaty inflicted on the Russians in 1918, when it looked like the Germans had won the First World War in the East. The German victors forced Russia to hand over control of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, its Baltic provinces, and land in the Caucasus. These territories comprised 34% of the Russian Empire's former population and 54% of its industry, 89% of its coal fields, and a quarter of its railways. That treaty was savage. Versailles was not particularly tough on Germany, but it was portrayed as such by Hitler, who saw that he could blame anything that was wrong in Germany on the Treaty of Versailles, on those evil, cruel foreign powers. He then rode this tidal wave of anti-Versailles resentment all the way into power. The First World War completely reshaped the world. Ancient empires were destroyed, new countries were born, and also new imperial ambitions. A lot of the myth-making around the war was born from the enormous disappointment that this huge, costly conflict did not lead to any lasting peace. The outbreak of the Second World War meant that many people saw the first as a pointless, destructive precursor to an even greater war. But it deserves to be remembered in its own right as a global conflict and one of astonishing technological change. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.